The elegant family dinner at the Morrison estate should have been a celebration, but instead it became the night Linda Morrison poured a pitcher of dirty dishwater over a man in worn jeans and a faded jacket, the man her daughter Rebecca had divorced 6 months ago for being a failure, a nobody, a waste of space who couldn't provide the lifestyle she deserved. What Linda didn't know, what none of them knew as Rebecca and her new lover David sat there laughing at the humiliation, was that the quiet man now dripping with filthy water and potato peels was actually James Caldwell, the reclusive multi-billionaire owner of Caldwell Industries, the massive corporation that employed every single member of the Morrison family, from Linda's executive assistant position to Rebecca's brother's management role to her father's senior director title. The company that paid for this very house, these designer clothes, this imported wine they were drinking while mocking the man who signed their paychecks. But James said nothing as the water dripped from his hair, just smiled that strange, knowing smile that made Linda's stomach suddenly clench with an inexplicable dread. What was he planning? Why wasn't he defending himself? And why did Rebecca's face suddenly drain of all color when James pulled out his phone and made a single, quiet call? What devastating truth was about to shatter their entire world? And how badly had they just destroyed their own lives without even knowing it? The Morrison family home radiated the kind of wealth that came from stable corporate careers and wise investments. Situated in Westchester Hills, where manicured lawns stretched between houses that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Inside the dining room, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over a mahogany table set with fine china, where Linda Morrison presided over her family's Sunday dinner with the satisfied air of a woman who had built a comfortable life through determination and strategic positioning. Her husband Gerald sat at the head of the table in his tailored suit, still wearing it from habit even on weekends, a man who had climbed to senior director at Caldwell Industries through 30 years of dedicated service. Their son Marcus occupied the seat to Gerald's right, following in his father's footsteps with his own management position at the same company, already calculating his path to vice president before he turned 40. And then there was Rebecca, Linda's pride and joy, her beautiful daughter who had finally come to her senses 6 months ago and divorced that deadweight James, that quiet nobody who had worked some vague entry-level position and never showed ambition, never fought for anything, never gave Rebecca the life she deserved. Now Rebecca sat radiant beside her new boyfriend David, a slick sales executive from a rival firm who wore expensive watches and drove a Porsche, the kind of man who knew how to treat a woman properly. Linda had spent the afternoon preparing her signature pot roast, the one she always made when the family gathered, the meal that represented everything she had built. As she worked in the kitchen, her mind wandered back to the day Rebecca had come home in tears, announcing she couldn't take it anymore, that James was holding her back, that she needed more than a man who seemed content with mediocrity. Linda had supported her daughter immediately, even though something about James had always puzzled her. He never seemed bothered by their not-so-subtle jabs about his lack of success, never fought back when Gerald made comments about real men providing properly for their families, never showed any anger at all. Just that quiet acceptance, that strange smile, those watchful eyes that sometimes made Linda feel like she was missing something important. But she pushed those thoughts aside because Rebecca deserved better, deserved a man like David who took her to expensive restaurants and bought her jewelry and talked about his investment portfolio. The doorbell rang just as Linda was draining the potatoes, and she heard Rebecca's sharp intake of breath from the dining room. "Mom, don't answer it," her daughter called out, an edge of panic in her voice that Linda had never heard before. But Gerald was already at the door, opening it to reveal James standing on their doorstep in worn jeans and a faded jacket that probably cost less than the doormat he stood on. He looked thinner than Linda remembered, his dark hair a bit longer, but those eyes were the same, calm and deep and hiding something she could never quite identify. "James," Gerald said, his voice cold with dismissal, "what are you doing here? You're not welcome in this house anymore. Rebecca made her choice, and we support her decision." "I know," James replied quietly, his voice steady and unremarkable. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Gerald. I just wanted to talk to Rebecca for a moment, There are some papers she needs to sign, some final details about the divorce settlement. Linda came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, irritation flashing through her. This man had some nerve showing up at their family dinner, reminding them all of Rebecca's mistake in ever marrying him in the first place. Rebecca had met James at some charity event 4 years ago, and she'd been charmed by something Linda never understood. Some quality that made her daughter ignore all the obvious signs that he was going nowhere. The wedding had been modest, too modest for Linda's taste, and James had never integrated properly into their family. He didn't golf with Gerald and Marcus, didn't discuss stock options or career advancement strategies, didn't seem to care about any of the things that mattered. He just smiled his quiet smile and said very little, and after 3 years of marriage, Rebecca had finally realized she'd married a man with no ambition, no drive, no future worth having. "Whatever papers you have can be mailed," Linda said sharply, moving to stand beside her husband. "This is family time, and you're not family anymore. You need to leave." James nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "I understand, but the papers are time-sensitive, Rebecca. They concern some accounts that need to be settled this week. I just need 5 minutes." From inside the dining room, David's voice rang out, dripping with contempt. "Hey, Rebecca, is that your loser ex-husband? The guy who couldn't even afford to take you on a decent vacation? Tell him to get lost. We're trying to enjoy dinner." Rebecca said nothing, but Linda saw her daughter's hands gripping the table edge, her knuckles white, her face strange and pale. Marcus laughed, standing up to join his parents at the door. "Yeah, man, seriously, what part of divorce don't you understand? My sister upgraded, big time. She's with a real man now, someone who actually has money and prospects." James looked past them into the dining room, his gaze finding Rebecca. And something flickered in his expression, something Linda couldn't name. Not anger exactly, not hurt, but something deeper and more complicated. "Rebecca knows," he said simply. "She knows why I'm here and what this is about. Don't you, Rebecca?" The question hung in the air, weighted with meaning that Linda couldn't grasp. Rebecca stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and Linda saw fear in her daughter's eyes now, raw and undisguised. "James, please," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry about everything. Just leave, and we can forget this." "Forget what?" Linda demanded, confusion mixing with her irritation. Why was Rebecca acting so strange? Why did she look terrified instead of angry? What was going on that Linda didn't understand? James remained silent, just watching Rebecca with those calm, unreadable eyes. And David stood up, puffing out his chest as he moved to stand behind Rebecca possessively. "Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to leave now before I make you leave. Rebecca's moved on. She's with me now, someone who can actually provide for her. Someone who matters." The word matters seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, and Linda saw something change in James's expression, just the tiniest shift, like a door closing on whatever patience he'd been exercising. He stepped into the house before Gerald could stop him, not aggressive but simply moving forward with quiet purpose, and Linda felt her irritation spike into anger. How dare he just walk into their home uninvited? She turned quickly, heading back to the kitchen where the pot of water from boiling potatoes sat in the sink, now murky and gray with starch and potato peels, and a sudden impulse overtook her. This man had wasted 3 years of her daughter's life, had held Rebecca back from her true potential, had been nothing but a burden and an embarrassment. He deserved to be treated like the trash he was, needed to be shown exactly how little respect he commanded in their family. Linda grabbed the pot with both hands, the dirty water sloshing inside, and marched back to where James stood in their foyer, still watching Rebecca with that unsettling calm. "You want to know what we think of you?" Linda said, her voice sharp with self-righteous anger. "You want to understand your place in this family? Let me show you." She raised the pot and poured it over James's head before anyone could react, the dirty gray water cascading over him, soaking his hair and jacket, dripping down his face, potato peels sliding down his shoulders to land at his feet. David burst into laughter immediately, loud and cruel, pointing at James as the water pooled around his worn sneakers. Rebecca's mouth opened, but no sound came out, her face frozen in horror. Marcus joined in the laughter after a moment, slapping the wall with delight. "Oh my God, Mom, that's perfect. That's exactly what this loser deserves." Gerald stood rigid, not laughing, but not stopping it either, his expression one of grim satisfaction, like justice had been served. Linda felt a surge of vindication, setting the empty pot down with a satisfying clang. There, she thought. Maybe now he'll understand that he means nothing to this family, that his presence is unwelcome, that Rebecca made the right choice, leaving him behind. But James didn't react the way she expected. He didn't yell or storm out, or even look particularly upset. He just stood there dripping, water running from his hair down his face, and smiled that strange, knowing smile that had always unnerved Linda. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone with careful, deliberate movements, and pressed a single button, bringing it to his ear. "Hello, Victoria," he said calmly into the phone, his voice pleasant and conversational, despite the dirty water dripping from his chin. "Yes, it's time. Initiate the Morrison protocol we discussed. All of them. Effective immediately. Yes, I'm certain. Thank you." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked around at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Rebecca, who had sunk back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. "You know," James said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather, and he wasn't standing in a pool of dirty water. "I gave you so many chances to be kind, Rebecca. So many opportunities to show your family who I really was. But you never wanted them to know, did you? You liked keeping them in the dark, liked letting them think I was nothing. I think you were embarrassed of me even before we got married." "What the hell are you talking about?" David demanded, his laughter fading into confusion. "And who's Victoria? Your imaginary secretary? Man, you're even more pathetic than Rebecca said." James ignored him, his eyes still on Rebecca. "Tell them," he said softly. "Tell them who I really am. Tell them where you really worked for the past 3 years. Tell them the truth you've been hiding because you were ashamed your husband wasn't flashy enough, wasn't public enough, didn't drive a sports car or wear designer suits." Rebecca's shoulders shook, and Linda realized with shock that her daughter was crying. Not angry tears, not frustrated tears, but the desperate, terrified tears of someone watching their entire world collapse. "I can't," Rebecca whispered. "James, please, I'll do anything. I'll call David right now and end things. We can work it out. Just please don't do this." "Tell them what?" Linda snapped, fear beginning to crawl up her spine because none of this made sense. Why was Rebecca begging? Why did she look so devastated? What did she know that the rest of them didn't? "Rebecca, what is he talking about? What truth?" Gerald moved toward James, his face reddening with anger. "I don't know what kind of mind games you think you're playing, but you need to get out of my house right now before I call the police. You're trespassing, and you're harassing my daughter." James finally looked away from Rebecca, turning his attention to Gerald. And something in his expression made Linda's breath catch. "Your house," he repeated quietly. "Bought with your salary from Caldwell Industries, where you've worked for 30 years, where you're senior director of operations reporting to the executive vice president, where Marcus is a department manager, where Linda is an executive assistant, where Rebecca worked in marketing until 6 months ago when she quit right after our divorce, unable to face the truth every day. All of you, your entire life, everything you have, all comes from Caldwell Industries." "So what?" Marcus said, his laughter completely gone now, replaced by confused defensiveness. "Yeah, we work for Caldwell. It's a great company. We've all built successful careers there. What does that have to do with anything?" James smiled again. And this time there was something sharp in it, something that had been hidden all these years behind the quiet demeanor and the patient acceptance. "It has everything to do with everything, because I am Caldwell Industries. Or more specifically, I'm James Caldwell, sole owner and CEO of Caldwell Industries, a position I've held since I inherited the company from my father 8 years ago. 2 years before I met Rebecca at that charity gala my company sponsored. The words landed like physical blows, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Linda felt the room spin, the elegant dining room suddenly tilting on its axis. That was impossible. That couldn't be true. James was nobody. James was a failure. James worked some entry-level position and had no money and no ambition and no future. James couldn't be the owner of Caldwell Industries, the man whose decisions affected thousands of employees, the billionaire whose name appeared on the building they all worked in, whose wealth was legendary, whose identity was famously private because he hated the spotlight and refused interviews and never made public appearances. But looking at him now, standing in their foyer dripping with dirty water, Linda saw what she had missed for years. The confidence beneath the quiet demeanor, the intelligence behind the watchful eyes, the power that didn't need to announce itself because it knew its own weight. And most damning of all, Rebecca's continued sobbing, her face now buried in her hands, her entire body shaking with the knowledge of what she'd thrown away and what was about to happen to her family. "You're lying," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. And he looked at Rebecca as if seeing her for the first time, seeing the truth written in her devastation. "Tell him he's lying, Rebecca. Tell him he's just some crazy ex trying to mess with you." But Rebecca couldn't speak, could only cry into her hands while the truth settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Gerald's phone rang first, the sharp trill cutting through the shocked silence. Then Marcus's phone, then Linda's. All three of them stood frozen, staring at James, at Rebecca, at each other. And finally Gerald pulled his phone from his pocket with a shaking hand and answered it. Linda watched her husband's face drain of all color as he listened to whoever was calling, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He lowered the phone slowly, looking at James with an expression of dawning horror and understanding. "That was HR," Gerald whispered, his voice barely audible. "They said I'm terminated, effective immediately. 30 years and I'm just terminated. They said the CEO personally ordered it and that security will be waiting tomorrow to escort me out of the building if I try to come in." Marcus's call ended a moment later, and he stared at his phone like it had bitten him. "I'm fired too. They said I'm fired. Me and Dad and Mom, all three of us, effective immediately. How is this happening? How is this possible?" Linda's phone had gone to voicemail, but the notification showed a missed call from the same HR department, and she knew without listening to the message what it would say. Her job, her career, her stability, her identity for the past 15 years, gone in a single phone call, because she had poured dirty water on the man who owned the company, who signed her paychecks, who had been married to her daughter and subjected to her family's contempt for years, while he quietly endured their disrespect. James pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping water from his face with careful, deliberate movements. "You have 24 hours to vacate this house," he said calmly, as if discussing a mundane business matter. "It's company property, technically, part of Gerald's compensation package. Since Gerald no longer works for the company, you no longer have access to company assets. There's a clause in the contract about termination for cause resulting in immediate forfeiture of housing benefits. I believe you'll find everything in order legally." "You can't do this," Linda heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere far away, because this couldn't be happening, couldn't be real. "We have rights, we have protections. You can't just fire us all and kick us out of our home?" "I can, actually," James replied, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You can consult with lawyers if you'd like, but you'll find that at-will employment and the specific clauses in your contracts give me significant latitude, especially when there's documented cause for termination. And Victoria has been very thorough in documenting things over the years." He looked at Rebecca again, and his expression softened slightly, though the hard edge remained. "I loved you," he said simply. "I would have given you everything, Rebecca. I would have made you the happiest woman alive. But you were ashamed of me from the start. You never told your family who I really was, because you thought I should be someone different, someone more public, someone more obviously successful. You wanted me to be flashy and showy, and when I refused to change who I am, when I refused to announce my wealth like some kind of peacock, You decided I wasn't enough. You filed for divorce without even trying, without even giving me a chance to explain why I live the way I do, why I keep my identity private, why I value substance over appearance. Rebecca finally looked up, her face blotchy and tear-stained, mascara running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry, James. I was stupid and shallow, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. Please, I'll do anything. I'll tell them I made a mistake. I'll fix this. Just please don't destroy my family. But James was already moving toward the door, stepping carefully over the pool of dirty water, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor. I'm not destroying your family, Rebecca. I'm simply removing myself from their lives completely, which is what they've wanted all along. They made it very clear tonight what they think of me, how little I matter to them. So now they can build their lives without any connection to me whatsoever. No job at my company, no house paid for with my money, no benefits derived from my success. They wanted nothing to do with me, and now they'll have exactly that. Nothing. He paused at the door, looking back one last time at Linda, who stood frozen in her dining room, her perfect Sunday dinner forgotten, her comfortable life crumbling around her. You poured dirty water on me, James said quietly, because you thought I was trash, something worthless to be discarded and humiliated. But that dirty water was probably the most honest thing to happen between us in 4 years. At least now we all know where we really stand. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Linda heard the sound of an engine starting, expensive and powerful. The kind of car she'd never seen James drive. The kind of car a billionaire would drive when he wasn't pretending to be nobody, when he wasn't testing the people around him to see if they'd love him for himself rather than his money. David stood awkwardly in the dining room, looking at Rebecca like she'd suddenly become a stranger. You were married to James Caldwell, he said, disbelief and dawning anger mixing in his voice. The James Caldwell? And you never told me? And you divorced him? Are you insane? Rebecca turned on him with sudden fury, all her devastation channeling into rage. Get out, she snarled. Get out of my house right now. It's not your house, David shot back. Apparently it belongs to your ex-husband, and you have 24 hours to get out. God, Rebecca, I can't believe you. I actually can't believe you divorced a billionaire because he wore jeans and didn't brag about his money. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out, leaving the Morrison family alone in their soon-to-be former home, surrounded by the ruins of their comfortable life. Gerald sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Marcus paced back and forth, his phone in his hand, frantically searching for information about James Caldwell online, pulling up articles that confirmed everything. Photos of a younger man who looked like James but stood in boardrooms and conference halls, the famously reclusive CEO who had built his inherited company into a multi-billion-dollar empire while maintaining almost complete privacy. I don't understand, Marcus kept saying. Why would he live like that? Why would he pretend to be poor? What was the point? But Linda understood finally, standing in her kitchen where the empty pot sat in the sink, where she'd made the decision that destroyed everything. James hadn't been pretending to be poor. He'd simply been living according to his own values, refusing to let wealth define him, refusing to perform success for people who should have valued him for other reasons. And Rebecca had been ashamed of that, had wanted a husband who announced his status, who played the part of the successful man in obvious ways. She'd been embarrassed that James drove an old truck and wore simple clothes and didn't take her to exclusive clubs. She'd never told her family the truth because she'd been hoping he would change, would become more like what she wanted, more like David with his Porsche and his expensive watches and his loud proclamations of success. And Linda, in her righteous anger and her protective instinct for her daughter, had poured dirty water over a man worth billions, over the man who employed her entire family, over the man who had endured years of subtle and not so subtle disrespect with patient grace. She had humiliated him in his own house, essentially, surrounded by his own money, in front of people whose livelihoods depended on his goodwill. And she'd done it while laughing, while feeling superior, while thinking she was teaching a lesson to someone who needed to learn his place. The irony was devastating. Rebecca's phone rang, and she answered it with shaking hands. Linda watched her daughter listen in silence, watched fresh tears stream down her face, watched her nod even though whoever was calling couldn't see her. When Rebecca ended the call, she looked at her family with hollow eyes. "That was James's assistant, Victoria," she said dully. "She wanted to inform me that James is filing a motion to modify our divorce settlement. He's removing the alimony provision since I obtained it under false pretenses. Apparently, I never disclosed during the divorce proceedings that I knew his true net worth, and I deliberately pursued a settlement based on the fiction that he was nearly broke. She says their lawyers will argue I committed fraud and that I'm lucky they're only removing alimony rather than pursuing charges." "How much alimony?" Linda asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. $50,000 a month, Rebecca whispered, "for 10 years. That was the settlement. I thought I was being smart, thought I was getting away with something because James didn't fight it. But he knew. He knew the whole time what I was doing, and he let me do it because he wanted to see how far I'd go. He wanted to know who I really was." Linda sank into a chair beside Gerald, the magnitude of their loss finally becoming real. They'd had everything. Good jobs, financial security, a beautiful home, a daughter who had been married to a man worth billions who loved her enough to hide his wealth to find genuine connection, and they'd thrown it all away for pride, for shallow judgment, for cruelty masquerading as justified anger. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice small and lost, nothing like the confident manager who'd been laughing 30 minutes ago. Nobody had an answer. The pot roast Linda had spent all afternoon preparing sat forgotten on the table, growing cold in the elegant dining room of a house they no longer owned, surrounded by possessions they'd bought with money from a company that no longer employed them, the remnants of a life that had been built on a foundation they'd just kicked out from under themselves. Linda looked at her hands, still damp from the dirty water, and understood with perfect clarity that she had just destroyed her family with a single impulsive act. She had poured water on a man she thought was beneath her, and in doing so, had revealed exactly who was really beneath whom. She thought of James standing in the foyer, water dripping from his hair, smiling that strange smile, making that single phone call that ended their comfortable existence. She thought of the patience it must have taken to endure their disrespect for years, the strength required to not retaliate immediately, the discipline to wait for exactly the right moment to show them the truth. And she thought of how he must have loved Rebecca, truly loved her, to hide such a fundamental part of his identity in hopes she would love him for himself. How it must have broken something in him when Rebecca filed for divorce, when she proved that she valued appearance over substance, status over character, flashy displays over quiet integrity. Linda had thought she was protecting her daughter, but Rebecca hadn't needed protection from James. She'd needed protection from her own shallow values, from her family's encouragement of those values, from the belief that worth was something you could measure in sports cars and designer suits and public displays of wealth. The doorbell rang again, making them all jump. Linda opened it to find a man in an expensive suit holding a folder of documents. "Morrison family?" he asked professionally. "I'm from the law firm representing Mr. Caldwell. These are the eviction notices for this property. You have until tomorrow at 6 p.m. to remove your belongings. After that time, anything remaining will be considered abandoned property. There's also documentation here regarding the termination of employment and the legal grounds for such termination. Mr. Caldwell wanted me to emphasize that while you're free to pursue legal action, you should know that he has extensive documentation supporting his decisions, and any lawsuit will likely be expensive and unsuccessful. However, if you choose to accept these terms without legal challenge, he's prepared to offer a modest severance package to help with your transition." The man handed Gerald the folder, nodded politely and walked away, leaving them holding the physical proof of their destruction. Gerald opened the folder with shaking hands, pulling out document after document, each one meticulously detailed, each one legally sound, each one another nail in the coffin of their former life. "There's a severance offer here," Gerald said, his voice hollow. $50,000 total, split between the three of us. For 30 years of service, I get $17,000 and 24 hours to leave my home. "That's not fair," Marcus protested. "Dad, we have to fight this. We have to sue him. We have rights." But Rebecca shook her head, her expression empty and broken. He owns everything, Marcus. His company, his money, his lawyers. Fighting him will cost more than we'd ever win, and he knows it. This is his mercy, giving us anything at all. We should take it and be grateful he's not destroying us completely. Grateful? Linda heard herself laugh, a harsh, bitter sound. We should be grateful to the man I just humiliated in our home. His home, Mom, Rebecca corrected quietly. It was always his home. Everything was always his. We just didn't know it because I was too ashamed to tell you. I married one of the richest men in the country, and I was embarrassed because he didn't act rich enough for me. Do you understand how insane that is? How perfectly it shows what kind of person I really am? Linda wanted to argue, wanted to defend their actions, wanted to insist they'd been justified. But sitting in that dining room, looking at the ruins of their comfortable life, watching her daughter's devastation, seeing her husband's broken expression and her son's confusion, she couldn't find any justification that made sense. They had been cruel to a kind man. They had mocked someone who had treated them with patience. They had laughed at the humiliation of a person who had never done anything to hurt them, except fail to advertise his wealth loudly enough for their shallow standards. And Linda had poured dirty water on him like he was trash. The memory would haunt her forever, she realized. The image of James standing there dripping, smiling that knowing smile, making that single call that ended everything. The look in his eyes that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment, this final proof of who they really were beneath their respectable exteriors, the calmness with which he'd accepted their cruelty and then responded with devastating precision. We need to pack, Gerald said finally, his voice thick with grief and shock. We need to figure out where we're going to go, what we're going to do. We need to call lawyers and accountants and start salvaging whatever we can from this disaster. But as her family began making frantic phone calls and discussing options, Linda remained seated, staring at the cold pot roast, thinking about the moment everything changed. Not when Rebecca filed for divorce, though that was part of it. Not when they'd spent years subtly insulting James, though that mattered too. But tonight, in this kitchen, when Linda had decided to humiliate a man she thought was worthless and discovered too late that he was worth more than her entire family combined, and not just in money. The dirty water had revealed the truth about all of them. James had been tested by poverty that wasn't real, and he'd remained kind and patient. They'd been tested by wealth they didn't know existed, and they'd revealed themselves to be shallow and cruel. The water Linda had poured was dirty, yes, but not as dirty as the characters it had exposed when it washed away the pretense of respectability and showed what lay beneath. Rebecca came and sat beside her mother, the two women united in their devastation. He used to bring me coffee in bed every morning, Rebecca said softly, her voice breaking. He used to leave little notes hidden around the house for me to find. He knew everything I liked, remembered every story I told him, supported every dream I mentioned. He was perfect, Mom. He was absolutely perfect, and I threw him away because he drove a truck instead of a Tesla, because he wore jeans instead of suits, because he didn't perform wealth for the world to see. I had everything, and I destroyed it because I'm an idiot who values all the wrong things. Linda put her arm around her daughter, and they sat there together, mourning not just the loss of jobs and house and financial security, but the loss of something far more valuable that they'd never appreciated when they had it. A good man's respect, a good man's love, a good man's patience. All of it exhausted tonight, all of it transformed into the devastating justice of consequences earned and delivered without malice, just inevitable cause and effect. The dirty water had dried now, leaving faint stains on the hardwood floor that would remain after they left. A permanent reminder to whoever moved into this house next of the night, the Morrison family learned the hardest lesson of their lives. That worth isn't measured in displays and announcements. That wealth means nothing compared to character. That sometimes the quietest person in the room is actually the most powerful, just choosing not to exercise that power until mercy has been exhausted and truth must finally be served. James Caldwell had given them every chance to be kind, to value him for himself, to show the content of their own characters. And when they'd failed every test, when they'd revealed themselves completely through their cruelty and laughter and dirty water, he'd simply removed himself from their lives with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a cancer. Linda wondered if he was home now, in whatever mansion he actually lived in, washing the dirty water from his hair, and finally allowing himself to feel the hurt they'd caused over years of disrespect. Or if he'd moved past it already, relieved to be free of people who had never deserved his patience in the first place. She wondered if he felt victorious or just tired, satisfied or still wounded, vindicated or simply sad that it had come to this. But mostly she wondered how she would ever forgive herself for pouring dirty water on the best man her daughter had ever known, and in doing so, drowning her entire family's future in one impulsive, arrogant, catastrophically misjudged act of cruelty that had revealed them all to be exactly as worthless as the trash they treated James like he was. The pot roast grew cold, the house grew quiet, and the Morrison family began the painful process of packing up their lives and facing a future they destroyed with their own hands. One pitcher of dirty water and years of shallow judgment at a time.